Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I'm joined here by my co-host, Nick Levitch. And we have a very exciting and informative episode for you all today. Today, we are joined by a wonderful guest, Josh Kappel, and we're going to talk about Colorado Prop 122, which was just passed in the November ballot of this year. So Joshua Kappel, who is a founding partner of Vicente Cederberg with the practice devoted to helping entrepreneurs and like-minded professionals build human-centric and regenerative companies in the cannabis and psychedelic communities. Josh also has a passion for helping advocates draft legislation and build sustaining vehicles that will forever influence these emerging industries. Recently, Mr. Kappel was a co-author and chair of the campaign committee for Colorado's Prop 122, which we'll be discussing today, which was the first successful state ballot measure to create access to natural psychedelic healing through both a state-regulated model and a decentralized community healing model. Josh was also a drafter of Denver's psilocybin decriminalization initiative and has assisted in drafting cannabis and psychedelic measures across the country. A big welcome to you, Josh. Thank you for joining us. Just really grateful to have you here and just looking forward to diving in and educating, Colorado citizens as well as potential and future psychedelic facilitators and service providers out there.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy and Nicholas. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for those who don't reside in Colorado and probably didn't vote on this. Prop 122 may not mean much of anything. So for those that, potentially reside out of state or just aren't familiar, what is Prop 122?
Yeah, for sure. So Prop 122, also known as the Natural Medicine Health Act, is a state initiative in Colorado. That as Jimmy mentioned, as one of the lead drafters on and also chaired the campaign committee. So I'm a little biased, but but really what it is it's a statutory measure that came on the ballot based off of the campaign we were working on, collecting 200,000 plus signatures, sort of force a vote on this policy. And high level, we'll dive into high level. What the purpose of Prop 122, or the Natural Medicine Health Act, is to create access to natural psychedelics, in a healing context, and it does it really in two ways. One, it sets up like a state regulated model that I'm sure we'll dive into, and also creates access to like a personal use community healing model.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention to listeners that Prop 122 is a statewide measure. And so when folks are reading online that, Ann Arbor and Detroit have decriminalized psychedelics, and Oakland and, a lot of other cities and local municipalities, Prop 122 is a statewide implementation. And the only other statewide measures would be in Oregon with measure 108 and 109. But I'm hearing you say that there's two parts to Prop 122, which is to establish a regulatory framework around psychedelics and psychedelic support services. And then the other side, which is decriminalizing the possession, use, consumption of certain psychedelics, right? Not all. And so what are you defining as natural medicines?
Great question. And you're right. And I'll keep, I think throughout our conversation, I think it's good there's a public regulated model and there's like a private personal use community model. I think it's good to distinction the two. And so what we've defined as natural medicines under the Natural Medicine Health Act is psilocybin, DMT, ibogaine, and mescaline, but not from peyote. And how it plays out is actually different in both models. On the regulated model, it just includes psilocybin and psilocybin, and maybe in the future, other of these enumerated natural psychedelics could be added to it. On the personal use model, it includes all of these natural psychedelics, the day this measure goes into effect.
Got it. And before we move any further, it's also important to mention that though Josh is an attorney and though he is a co-author and a drafter of these measures, what we're going to be talking today should not be misconstrued as legal advice. We want to just talk about this from an information standpoint, from a public policy standpoint, from a harm reduction standpoint, but just know that any actions that you all as listeners take are still within your own, risk tolerances and choices there. So that's probably important for us to say. I don't want somebody to be like, well, I listened to the Psychedelic Passage podcast and they said that I could do this. So what's allowed and not allowed? I guess let's focus on the personal use side maybe to start. What's allowed, what's not allowed? One of the things that I think that is really interesting about Prop 122 versus like Amendment 64 and other cannabis regulations is that it doesn't create a recreational model where you can just run to a dispensary or a storefront to buy psychedelics. So maybe we could just use that as a jumping off of what's permissible and not permissible in the personal use side.
Yeah, no, and I'm actually gonna take a slight step back to sort of build a little bit on the legal disclaimer. So I think it's really important to know that everything that's permitted under Prop 122 is illegal under federal law. And so, similar to cannabis, it's like if you possess cannabis in Colorado, you're still violating federal law. Now, how this works from a legal perspective, generally, is that like 99% of all drug arrests are made at the state level, not the city level, but at the state level. And so when you look at these different, psychedelic ballot measures moving forward, you have some at the city level. You have some at the state level, and then maybe one day we'll see some at the federal level. But what we did with Prop 122 is we just focused on the state level. And yes, it's like I was also one of the drafters of the psilocybin measure in Denver that decriminalized psilocybin in Denver. But it's important to note that even these city-based laws actually don't change any criminal laws. They're really just a statement for the law enforcement to not enforce a state criminal law. And so what we did with Prop 122 is we actually changed state criminal law, which effectively changes 98% of all arrests in Colorado related to these natural psychedelics. And so to your point about what is permitted, under the personal use section, it is not a crime under state law. It's decriminalized to possess, to share, to cultivate, to process, to ingest, to purchase different natural psychedelics. And there's some limitations there that are worth highlighting. One, is like if you're cultivating or processing, natural psychedelics, it has to be done in a private residence and it has to be secure from those under the age of 21. So that's like one key piece of it. If you're sharing natural psychedelics with your community, and I'm sure we'll dive into this more because everyone's really curious about the sharing piece, you're not allowed to share it and receive any remuneration, which means anything of value. And you're not allowed to commercialize the sharing of it. But there is a couple exceptions around, being, if folks are being paid for true harm reduction services or true therapy services. There's also limitations in the measure that I think are really key around, you can't use these natural medicines and go drive a vehicle or a boat. You can't possess these on government-owned property, and not just purely government-owned property, but but it's really a school, a detention facility, or another like public building.
Yeah, and I think for Colorado, it's also like federal land, BLM land for those who want to, engage with psychedelics in nature or go on hikes and things like that too, that I'm hearing that you're not necessarily protected if you do end up on, national land or in a national park or something like that.
Right. I mean, people have been eating psychedelics in Colorado, and and walking through our national parks and national forests, since the beginning of Colorado. Um, with that said, though, you're absolutely right. Possession of these natural psychedelics in on federal property is still, imposes a greater risk because this is still illegal under federal law. And we saw this with cannabis, where folks at Rocky Mountain National Park would receive tickets for possessing cannabis in Rocky Mountain National Park. And so there is an issue like possessing on federal land. There's a prohibition or a limitation that you can't ingest these natural medicines it really like in a public place. Now that ingestion doesn't like apply to possessing or like or walking around on the streets like while you're already like you know on a microdose or on or in some other safe manner. And it's I think another piece too is the age limitations. It's like the age limitations is 21. So none of this applies to anyone under the age of 21. Bringing or providing these natural psychedelics to those under the age of 21 could still subject someone to to probably pretty severe criminal penalties.
Mm.
There is like limitations around that. There's also part of there's also a bunch of like civil protections too that are probably like worth talking about around the personal use section.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, and so in addition to just decriminalizing or removing criminal penalties for engaging in these acts, there's also protections. There's also protections around professional licensure. So you can't like I can't lose my law license if I'm engaging in the personal use of natural medicines,
Uh,
or like a therapist can't lose their license for sharing natural medicines with someone provided within the confines of the act. So that's a key piece of this puzzle. There's protections if you're on probation and parole, you can use natural medicines. And a
wow.
lot of times this is really huge because like a lot of times there's so much trauma that comes from being in our very antiquated criminal justice system. Whether if it's what got you there or actually just being in it. So, there's protections around that. There's protections around receiving medical care. A big issue we saw in the cannabis space is people be denied organ transplants because they were engaging
Wow.
in like an illegal drug. And so this is like, no, you can't be denied medical care just because you're engaging in natural psychedelic medicines. A super big one is there's protections around child rearing, and this one's so key. Both in terms of like child endangerment and child custody issues, but also in sort of like divorce and separation proceedings. So it's like one,
Uh,
and for like truly protecting our community, that's like a very key piece of the puzzle. There's a couple other, sort of like nuances, around, the personal use section. There's, protections around sort of like drug paraphernalia, around natural psychedelic medicines. You're allowed to sort of like possess, mushroom grow kits. And there's actually, it's a long story, but there's actually becoming legal under federal law in some cases, based
mm.
on how federal law works with drug paraphernalia. Um,
What about veterans and like the VA? I just think about these like protections here, and I know during my time in cannabis, there was kind of this this secrecy where people working at the VA wouldn't like disclose if a veteran was using cannabis for some type of some type of relief, but just knowing that the VA, let's say, could take away benefits or whatever if somebody was using cannabis. That obviously has changed a little bit now, but is there any parallel or application to that here?
yes, so there's it's tough because the VA is a federally
Right,
it's a federal institution, and there are
exactly.
groups, like Reason for Hope, that are working on this VA issue. But it's unclear how the VA will treat different natural psychedelics on this personal use side. Um, the yeah.
What
Um,
about like welfare? and things like that. Because I heard you talking about like, child protection. Like I immediately thought about like, okay, parents are divorcing, it's getting nasty. You can't use the fact that one parent is microdosing to prove that they're gonna be endangering the child, or that there's gonna be negligence there, which I really appreciate. But welfare programs, things like that.
Yeah, so there is protections on the civil side around public assistance. Now, with that said, it's like a lot of like the different public assistance programs are either delivered through the federal government or
Right.
or like quasi federal government and states. So there'll be interesting issues, around, it's like, for example, like housing assistance. It's like administered by the state of Colorado, but it's a federal program. How are they going to look at these issues? Will it actually become an issue? Like when we saw this become an issue in cannabis, so it was because people are growing cannabis, which is a very, it's just a more observable plant than mushrooms or another thing to note too, which is interesting, is like a lot of the natural psychedelics, except for mushrooms, are legal to grow anyways. So you can grow cactus. All of the cactus that contain mescaline, except for peyote, are legal to grow in Colorado. Same with like various plants that contain DMT. It's just generally it's like where the illegality has come in historically is around sort of processing it. And so what this measure actually does is now like would allow you to process these natural plants on the personal use side.
So
Processing it, yeah.
one of the things that I heard you say, Josh, is that purchasing is allowed, but then there's no dispensaries and there's no commercialization.
And you
So
can't
can
sell
you,
it.
yeah, so
Yeah.
can you maybe elaborate as to how, if I want to purchase a natural medicine or maybe not purchase, but just obtain, how does one go about that under this new measure?
Right. And so it's like the idea on the personal use side is really for communities to grow it together and to share it, and we don't really want to encourage like the purchasing of natural psychedelics from folks who are illegally selling it, because you're really like putting them in legal jeopardy, and so it's not something like we're trying to like actively encourage. And there's like strict prohibitions against sales, and there's strict criminal penalties around selling these products too. So it's people who are selling them, they're really playing with fire. And and those who say like, oh, I'm gonna give you mushrooms with my, and you're gonna buy my harm reduction book. It's like that's like pretty much selling them, and you're pretty much like putting yourself in legal jeopardy. Now on the purchasing side, the part of it was just to clarify that it's like, hey, people who go in on the regulated side can purchase from healing centers, but it also does protect community healers from purchasing these products. If ayahuasca is purchasing, their medicines from somewhere, they're, it's like they are protected in that act. And
Uh,
so, so it is, to me, it's a key part of like dismantling our overall failed drug war policies. And frankly, if there was a provision, well, I don't know, there's an argument sometimes. It's like, hey, you should probably also decriminalize sales too. But the difficulty there is like, I'm a firm believer that like decriminalization without any limitations on the commercialization will lead to like rampant unchecked capitalism, like really taking hold of this industry. And that's like not what we want, or it's not what I want, right now.
well, it's exactly what happened with cannabis, and I'm trying really, really hard to withhold my own personal opinions here just to keep everything like a blank slate for our listeners. But, I think that there is something to learn about how regulations in cannabis unfolded, just even from a societal standpoint, where the first, 5, 7 years of cannabis, it really rode on medicinal programs and medicinal structures, and then now it's all about the next recreational market and the next recreational state. And so, one thing that I appreciate about Prop 122, and I acknowledge that there's a lot of opinions even within the psychedelic community, even within the, you know communities of Colorado at large about different parts and implementation of Prop 122. But one thing that I appreciate is this relationship between the substance and the plant medicine itself and community and services around that. So when I hear you say that there's not a commercial framework around the cultivation and selling of these plant medicines, it sounds like under certain conditions, providing true harm reduction services, providing true therapy services, being in communities that focus on those things, that there are some some thoughtfulness around that.
Yeah, and so I appreciate that. And I think that there's a lot of, that there's a lot of risk with just unchecked extractive capitalism, and what does it mean when companies come in and they're looking to extract as much as they can from a community and profit off of it. And we've seen that in every industry almost, in the world.
I've always said humans love to colonize stuff, and one of the main vehicles of colonization is capitalism. So I gotta pull my opinions back off now. So I'm back to neutral. I promise, I'm back to neutral.
I mean, I appreciate your opinions, Jimmy. So, but to unpack that for a second, it's like the idea here was like, hey, on the regulated side, where there will be companies that can participate and there'll be like some forms of commercialization. If we get out in front of it on the regulated side, we can actually make, we can make it equity first. We can make it justice oriented. We can, limit the harms of capitalism. And I can sort of like unpack the different pieces we put in there to try and do that and how we got to that process. But before I do, I think it's important to note that like on this personal use side, why this was so important for us was this like community-based healing model. And it's like, and how do we, allow community healing to happen in a manner where people aren't scared of, the police knocking on the door, during an IS ceremony. They're not scared. That therapist isn't scared, that they're truly there, truly there with their patients, of like, working with them around psilocybin, even in the unregulated side of things. And with that said, though, it's like there is limitations on like on the personal use section that, one of those being this prohibition on commercialization, and this prohibition on commercialization, prohibits giving these medicines away as part of a business promotion or otherwise commercializing it. Also prohibits paid advertising, related to sort of, concurrent services. And the paid advertising, I think, is like a big piece of this, because the idea is, hey, how do we protect, personal use and community healing without opening the door for like unchecked capitalism, and that's sort of like the idealistic structure.
Well, it's funny because what you're describing, I can see how the intention is that it functions much more like how these medicines would be used indigenously. Like you go to your local healer and they provide healing services for you, oftentimes at no cost or just because you're a part of the community. And it's not designed to be for profit. It's designed to be for impact.
I think that's right. And there's carve outs too. So it's like, if you're that community healer, it's like, yes, there's, and you're truly providing support services and you're truly providing, harm reduction services, like you can be paid for that, because it's like community healers also deserve to get paid. And so that's like a key piece too, but it's been really hard to thread the needle. And I think we'll see as this unfolds, we'll see some developments here. We'll, hopefully not, like hopefully everything just stays as it is, but I think we could see people trying to take advantage of it and then, risk criminal prosecution. We could see there's a lot of legislatures and a lot of the political establishment that are really, really concerned about this model. And so there might be some fights at the Capitol around it. Hopefully not, but, I think we'll see things, sort of develop. And a big thing that I think is like, in my mind so key is like if we can, as a community, it's like, sort of self-regulate this unregulated model, we can avoid the government stepping in. And I think like
Yeah.
if like as a community we fail to, regulate, self-regulate this unregulated model, and there's bad actors and they give everyone a bad name, we'll likely see the government step in and like and limit things and clarify things and shut a lot of things down. And that could have really drastic effects for like a lot of different community healers and community groups.
Yeah, there's like the acts that you do as an individual can affect the collective. And so the main things that I'm hearing to all my cannabis colleagues out there, that like commercial grows are not a thing unless you are connected to a service or a healing center, or for the very ambitious and entrepreneurial people who are, creating packaging and going out on the 16th Street Mall to dish out, psilocybin, like that could put the whole implementation of this into major jeopardy. Are there possession limits to the personal side?
No, they're not. And this is a hot topic. Great question. So there's, this was sort of like a highly negotiated topic, during the drafting phase, between, the National Medicine Health Act and New Approach and SPORE and the My Coalition of, and the decriminalization folks, like, hey, should there be limits? Should there not be limits? There's sort of pros and cons on both sides. But without rehashing old debates, here's where it stands now is, you can possess whatever is necessary for you and for you to give to your community. And what is that? I mean, I think it's pretty broad. There's not,
Right.
it's at some point it's like what you have is unreasonable. It's like, hey, I have 10,000 pounds of mushrooms and it's just me in a car on my way to, the Kansas border. And it's like, is that really necessary for you personally? Like, I don't know. But it's like how it's set up and how it's acted. It's like, no, it's like it truly is. You can pretty much have as much as like is reasonably necessary for you and your community.
Yeah, and that ranges, right? Because Nick and the clients that we work with, for some folks, 2 grams is the right amount for them. For some folks, they're in 7, 8, 9 territory, even more territory. So even within the like individual, there's quite a range there on
and
what's
then I also
right.
think about like, this comes up with cannabis grows a lot, is like you have your 4 plants and then you harvest, and then the harvest weight exceeds the personal possession amount. And like it's so easy to have the same thing happen with growing psilocybin. You've got a tub of psilocybin that's fruiting, and like if you arbitrarily pass those limits, like you don't know how much a harvest is going to yield. It's just a challenging game to play.
Yeah, before the drying process where you lose 80% of the moisture and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when you think about like what's necessary for someone, it's not only about like individual quantities of like how much do you take at a time, it's also about frequency of use and time that you have to grow again. So it might be, hey, I want to, cultivate some mushrooms before I have my entire family over for the holidays, and I don't want kids running around. And so I have a small window where I can cultivate mushrooms that needs to take me over the next number of years, or, or whatever it might look like, based off of, my microdosing regimen, or based off of, wanting to have, a hero dose every quarter, or every month, like all these different pieces, sort of adjust like, hey, what is actually necessary? And as you mentioned, it's so hard to define what that number is for each person, and and then what the cultivation looks like and the drying process, and then each of these natural medicines is completely different.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that psychedelics embedded within it have some counter capitalist things as far as frequency of use, right? Like when folks have a big psychedelic experience, unless they're in a specific ceremony or lineage or retreat structure where they're, communing with the medicine a couple of nights in a row, likely you're not going to want to go back and have that experience like right away. And even with microdosing, where folks are using, specific medicines daily, or 2 days on, 1 day off, or, 3, 4 days on in the week or whatnot, they're small amounts. We're talking about like a 30th or a 60th of what would constitute like a hallucinogenic, dose. And so embedded in there is this anti-capitalism where like I don't think somebody would be going to a dispensary, let's say, using that model like every day, like some folks do, or using psychedelics like cannabis like every day. And no disrespect to those folks, like to reiterate, I'm very much like a radical free will personal choice type of person, but I just appreciate that there is this effort to say, hey, psychedelics are not these standalone things. They should be used as tools, should be used in community, should be used in some type of a structure. Now, there is a debate, I think, within the psychedelic community about, okay, how does that look? The implementation side of this, is this addressing like community needs? And I kind of hear you alluding to that in what you're saying, where like, who knows what would be prosecuted or not prosecuted, or how this actually gets implemented over time. So am I understanding it correctly that this measure is not in effect yet, at least on the personal use side, and then that there will be this whole implementation process? Or can you highlight that a little bit for us?
Yeah, no, great question on the effective date and and I do want to acknowledge there is a lot of ambiguity under the personal use section as soon as money is involved. If you keep money completely out of the equation, it's pretty clear. You can possess, you can use, you can grow, you can share. And once you add money in, then it becomes a little ambiguous. And that's like, how it works, becomes a little, yeah, there's just more of a spectrum of what is true like community healing and support, and what is, commercialization. But with that said, to your point about the effective date, so the measure, it depends. There's like an either or clause, so it becomes effective upon like the official declaration of the vote, which we, expect, could happen, could happen any day, but probably by the latest, like January 5th or January 15th, 30 days thereafter.
Oh, that's Nick's birthday. Perfect.
Yeah, right. Celebrate.
Happy birthday, Nick.
But I think it's also key to note that it's like this measure is retroactive, so it applies to all cases pending. So it's, and so we saw this, with the rabbi in Denver whose case was dismissed, based off of Prop 122 going into effect.
Oh, wow.
And for those who are following, it's, just sort of like the real world implications of it, of, hey, there's, rabbi who's leading community healing circles, talked to the media about it, was arrested, the next day after he was on the, maybe a few days after. And then, just recently, it's like that case was dismissed because when the prosecutors looked at Prop 122 and how it applied to this case, it said, this conduct's legal now. And there's this retroactive application to it. So it's like its effective date is, likely sometime in January, but practically because of like the retroactive piece of it, it's like more or less effective to that.
Got it. So what we've naturally done here is that we focused this whole conversation on the personal use side. And so maybe what might make sense is we can make sure that you are addressing all the things that you want to share with, the public and the community about the personal use side. And then we can jump into another episode that talks about the regulated, model side, because I know we have a lot of listeners who are facilitators and service providers and in healing communities. So what things have we not covered that you feel are very important for, just the public at large, anybody who's just interested in what's happening in Colorado regarding natural medicines, regardless of whether you live here or not. So what things would you share with folks?
Yeah, a couple other key pieces, on the personal use side. One is that, there is limitations, like if you take psychedelics and you harm someone else, like there's gonna be consequences, whether it's like an existing law or this law is not gonna cover it, so it's, so just be mindful of that. It's like
This
operating.
doesn't give you a hall pass to be an asshole.
Right, exactly.
I think that's actually the language in the rule I read.
Yeah, it's like 12, 170, 11, like hall
Don't
pass.
be an asshole. Yeah. Okay,
It
that's
also
important. That's important.
it's also a big deal is it doesn't provide employee protections. This is something like worth noting where, and drug tests around psilocybin, not all drug tests, test for psilocybin or psilocybin or mescaline or DMT, but if your company does have drug tests that test for that and they mandate it, it's not going to save you from your job. And this is sort of like key, especially, if you're a federal contractor, or you're working within like a high security job or a safety sensitive job, there could be truck drivers, et cetera, there could be some issues.
You're a school teacher, you are some type of a counselor. So this is actually really important because there's a huge part of the population who microdose for work performance and mental acuity and stress resilience and all of that. I'm reminded of the story in Silicon Valley of the CEO who took LSD before a board meeting, and there was probably a lot more history there, but their major claim was that he was high on LSD, and so they let him go. And then now it's a whole different case with potential discrimination based on his ethnicity and all of that. But it's a really important thing because there's a lot of people out there who are gonna pop a microdose, right before work or an hour before work, and so you're not protected from an employee standpoint if you're caught in some degree.
Right, and thankfully, like we're moving more towards a world where employers find that like drug tests is like a blunt instrument of measuring like employee job performance doesn't work, and you actually won't have a lot of employees if that's your case in Colorado. But you're absolutely right. It's if you tell your HR department, hey, you're microdosing, because like, oh, this person just admitted that they're doing an illegal drug before they come to work, and and let you go, and there won't be protections in here for that. Now there is a lot of companies, that are encouraging microdosing, and I encourage people to support those companies, but it's, but we're not quite there yet. So I think that's a key piece, though, is this employment piece. The other thing too is there's sort of like record sealing built in. It's
Awesome.
it's not automatic, so there is some steps that need to be taken. But if you've been convicted of an offense that would now be legal under this measure, there's a streamlined process for sealing your record. And not for a shameless plug, but with Vicente Cedarberg and College Campus, I believe we're like plotting a record sealing clinic for like the first or second weekend in January. For those, for those who need help, filing the paperwork.
I'm obviously biased, but I don't think that's a shameless plug at all, because one of the things that we see here is that there's a gap that Nick and I see is that there's a gap in the new regulations and the new hot interest around psychedelics, and a huge gap in the actionable side of it. Okay, what do we do with this? Like, how do I get my record sealed or expunged or whatnot? And out of curiosity, I know we're kind of running into time a little bit here, but are there a big number of people in Colorado who are incarcerated at a state level for psychedelics?
No, there's not. It's actually less than 1% of all drug arrests in Colorado
Okay.
relate to psilocybin or psilocybin. So there's not, and a lot of these arrests too are generally like tied in with something else. And I think
Sure.
and actually like kind of goes to your point of not only are like psychedelics kind of anti-capitalist in their nature, based off of the transformative experiences and the non-addictive potential of it, but they're actually there's some studies come out that show that they actually lead to less crime and less violent behavior. They're more introspective, and they actually lead to better community members, and better people in society in some cases, And so, you don't see like the same sort of like public health issues, around psychedelics as you see around a lot more, or not even a lot more, just around like aggressive, non-healing based drugs.
It's funny, Paul Stamets spoke about that at Burning Man. He was like, we should be using these as rehabilitation tools, not as, reasons to put people in jail.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a number of, this is really exciting. Maybe this will be like a tease for, for step 2 on the regulated side, but there's a number of addiction companies in Colorado that are looking like, hey, how do we bring these medicines in to help, to get people off of their like chronic alcohol use or other, or different opium, addictions. And so that this is a big issue, it's like, psychedelics for the better, and that's, for me, it's like, why I'm in this space.
Yeah, which is why I appreciated Iboga and Ibogaine being included in here. Obviously, there's a cultural and historical aspect that needs to be respected around Ibogaine, but there's a lot of anecdotal, reports and evidence directly around substance use recovery. So, yeah. So, anything else, Josh, as we wrap up this episode here that you think would be important for folks to know on the personal side?
I mean, I think that like the biggest thing I think I would, to me, that I would love everyone to know who's in the Colorado psychedelic community is, it's like the personal use provisions they are really broad, and they're not meant to be commercialized. And, but there's, and there isn't, sort of government oversight. And without government oversight, we need community oversight and education, and we need to be supporting people and telling people what these medicines look like and what sort of dosages are appropriate and how first timers should use it. And there's a lot of, there's just a lot of opportunity here, for, the community to come together as a whole and sort of like, protect and keep this, personal use provisions sacred in many cases.
Yeah, there's a really great analogy that one of my friends used, which is really appropriate in Colorado, where like, rock climbing is really risky, but we're not going to fully outlaw rock climbing. We know that there's risks and people should be prepared and people should have their gear, people should have the knowledge, and people die rock climbing all the time. And people also rock climb very unsafely all the time and insert backpacking or backcountry skiing and all of that. And what happens is when those folks get rescued by search and rescue or they come back, they're shamed in their communities. They're like, you're an idiot, you should have checked the weather, you should have so and so, you should have. And so that's something that's really stuck with me, and I really hope that we do see that in our community. And Nick, I know you were going to say something before I jumped in there.
No, I was just gonna. All I was gonna say is that it is a bit of like a social experiment to see if we can self-regulate and take care of our neighbors, take care of each other, help people learn how to do this, and really like educate one another, because there's a big gap in education right now.
Yeah.
Right, and if what happens over the next couple of years, if it's all stories of people abusing the personal use section, then when other states look at this, they're only going to move forward on the regulated side, and we're going to, and we'll see reform that excludes this community model. And I think that would be, the largest shame of this whole experiment.
Yeah. So it's up to us, it sounds like. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for this, and thank you for joining us on our next episode as well. So this will wrap up our episode around the personal use decrim side of Colorado Prop 122. On the next episode, we'll talk and focus more on the regulatory, frameworks here. So thank you for joining us. You can download episodes of the Psychedelic Passage podcast by looking for all of our episodes. You can go to cannabisradio.com, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, it would be a great help and honor for us to rate, review, and just leave us some comments and thoughts on if what we talk about and the dialogue that we have are helpful to you. So thank you, Josh, and we will see you all next week.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.